Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Neil Atkinson, IGEM's Chief Executive Officer, and it's my pleasure to once more welcome you to the Sir Denis Rooke Memorial Lecture. As many of you will know, this lecture usually takes place face-to-face. Unfortunately, due to the continuing challenge of the pandemic, we're once again forced to bring this lecture to you virtually. Hopefully we can change things for next year. Now, since Chris Stark's Committee on Climate Change lecture last September, the institution has continued to make great strides in supporting the net zero agenda. As a few examples, I might highlight our draft gas quality standard that's been passed to the HSE for final impact assessment. Our high technical hydrogen standards for industry are also on track for delivery this summer. And our hydrogen training courses just continue to be routinely sold out at fairs. So the theme of today's memorial lecture on forging a path to net zero is very apt and very timely indeed. I'd first like to take a moment to run through this evening's event. When you joined the call, we asked you to mute and keep your video switched off. If I could just ask you to maintain this throughout, that would be much appreciated. Thank you. Questions for our guest will be taken following his presentation. So please submit your questions using the on-screen Q&A chat facility in the normal manner. And we will put these to Lord Browne on your behalf at the end of the lecture. We'll try and get through as many as the allotted time allows. And we are targeting a sharp close for this event at 7:30 this evening. So apologies in advance if it's not possible to ask all of your questions or answer all of your questions. This evening's lecture is being recorded and we will be making it available to view on IGEM TV from next week. So now it's my pleasure to invite IGEM immediate past President Tony Green to lead this event to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Lord Browne of Madingley.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Neil, and good evening to everybody. Whilst I'm disappointed it's not possible for us to host a face-to-face this evening, I'm absolutely thrilled that we can still carry on with this high-profile string of lectures that we have to remember Sir Denis Rooke. I first start with an apology. I am the stand-in for IGEM President Duncan Wong. He would have dearly loved to be with us this evening, but obviously it's not possible to travel at the moment. And given it's about 2:30 in the morning at the moment, we figured it was pretty unfair for him to have to chair the session this evening. So I'd like to start with a few words about Sir Denis Rooke. Sir Denis Rooke's great technical achievement and lasting legacy was to build the UK's gas distribution network and unite the gas industry, making domestic gas a cheap and convenient fuel source for millions of people. He acquired an awesome reputation as the Lion of British Gas in the 1980s as the Conservative government threatened to break up the British Gas Corporation during privatisation. His devoted employees saw him as the defender of his gas company against the most determined of politicians. Famously, he said, "Whilst I have to deal with politicians, that does not mean I have to like them." Lord Lawson of Blaby, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, reveals in his memoirs a certain awe of Sir Denis, having been on the receiving end of his championing of the gas industry, describing him as a large, craggy, overbearing man, treating ministers and officials alike with a mixture of distrust, dislike and contempt. Since retiring from British Gas, Sir Denis devoted his talent and determination to the engineering education, becoming Chancellor of Loughborough University in 1989. As President of the Royal Academy of Engineering, he drove the development of its education programme, and he also served on many national advisory committees on both energy policy and education. He was awarded a CBE in 1970 and knighted in 1977 for his service to the gas industry. He won the Academy's Prince Philip Medal for Engineering Achievement in 1992, the James Watt International Medal of the Institution of Mechanical Engineers, the George E. Davis Medal of the Institution of Chemical Engineers, and most importantly, the Golden Birmingham Medals of our own Institution of Gas Engineers. He also remains, most certainly, an outstanding and fondly remembered president of IGEM. So with that biography in mind, I'm absolutely delighted that our speaker this evening, Lord Browne of Madingley, is with us this evening. So a few words of introduction about Lord Browne. Lord Browne was born in 1948. He holds degrees in natural sciences from Cambridge and an MS in business from Stanford. He joined BP in 1966 as a university apprentice, and between 1969 and 1983 held a variety of exploration and production posts globally, and in 1984 was appointed group treasurer. And he was the chief financial officer of the Standard Oil Company. Sorry, I've lost my place there. He was the chief financial officer of the Standard Oil Company of Ohio during the BP Standard merger of 1987, and served as group chief executive of BP from 1995 to 2007. And during that period, he created the world's first supermajor through a series of mergers and acquisitions, including BP's merger with Amoco in 1998. His landmark speech at Stanford University in 1997 established BP as a global leader in the way it thought about and sought to address climate change. Lord Browne is the chairman of the Francis Crick Institute, a fellow and past president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, and chairman of the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering. He's also a fellow of the Royal Society and an honorary fellow of a number of institutions, and I'm pleased to say a companion member of IGEM. In 2007, he joined Riverstone, where he was co-head of the world's largest renewable energy private equity fund until 2015. And he's currently executive chairman of L1 Energy and chairman of Wintershall DEA, Europe's largest independent oil and gas company. He's also an investor in numerous companies operating at the intersection of science, engineering, energy, and climate change. Lord Browne was voted Most Admired CEO by Management Today every year between 1999 and 2002. He was knighted in 1998 and made a life peer in 2001. He's also previously served on the boards of Goldman Sachs, Intel, Daimler Chrysler, and SmithKline Beecham. He was the UK government's lead non-executive board member from 2010 to 2015 and chaired the committee that authored the Browne Report, an independent review of higher education published in 2010. In 1999, the Royal Academy of Engineering awarded him the Prince Philip Medal for his outstanding contribution to engineering. He's currently chairman of the Courtauld Institute of Art, trustee of the Royal Opera House, and a trustee of the Holocaust Educational Trust. His interests are 16th century to 18th century illustrated Italian books, pre-Columbian art, contemporary art, music, opera, and the theatre, and Venice. I don't know how he has time to do all of this. Lord Browne is also the author of Beyond Business, 7 Elements That Change the World, The Glass Closet, Why Coming Out is Good for Business, and the Sunday Times bestseller, Connect, How Companies Succeed in Engaging Radically with Society. His 5th book, Make, Think, Imagine, Engineering the Future of Civilization, was published in 2019. So with all that background, it gives me great pleasure to hand over to Lord Browne to deliver his speech to us this evening for the Sir Denis Rooke Memorial Lecture. Lord Browne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony, very much. And ladies and gentlemen, good evening. It really is a very great pleasure and an honor to be asked to deliver the Sir Denis Rooke Memorial Lecture. Sir Denis was an inspirational leader, a robust negotiator, to my personal experience, and above all, an engineering innovator. In 1959, he personally oversaw the first shipment of liquefied natural gas from the US to the UK, paving the way for imports of gas from other nations. And he was instrumental in the decision to convert this nation's infrastructure and equipment to use natural gas, newly discovered in the southern North Sea, rather than town gas. This transformed Britain's environmental prospects by catalyzing the switch from dirtier to cleaner forms of hydrocarbons. Sir Denis helped to lay the foundations for the much grander challenge that we've now set ourselves, which is the topic of this lecture, forging a path to net zero. This will require a systematic transformation at a pace and scale never seen before. The world currently invests around $1.3 trillion every year in engineered products, businesses, and infrastructure, which help to decarbonize the economy. Combined with existing governmental policies, this puts us on a path to 3 degrees of warming by the end of the century, 3 degrees. To limit temperature change to 1.5 degrees, we need to cut greenhouse gas emissions in half by 2030. The most recent estimates suggest that we will need to double investment to approximately $3 trillion every year for the next 10 years. And that investment needs to be targeted at bringing engineered solutions up the learning curve and down the cost curve. My first point this evening. The path to net zero is not a challenge of discovery science. We already have the scientific breakthroughs to reduce emissions by around 85%. So the case for further investment in new discovery is of secondary importance. Our primary goal should be to deploy existing solutions at scale in order to make them cheaper and more effective. This, of course, is the oldest trick in the engineering book and can be traced back with real data through the centuries. When oil and gas executives joined the Tallow Chandlers Livery Company in the City of London, they probably don't realize that it represents one of the oldest learning curves around. It's possible to trace the price of light from candles in the year 1300 to LED lighting that we all take for granted today. Over that 700-year period, the price of a unit of artificial light has fallen by a factor of approximately 40,000, or 1.5% every year. So it's always good to have history on your side. We also have, of course, much more recent examples. Bloomberg estimates that every time we've doubled the number of wind turbines manufactured, their cost has declined by almost 15%. This is equivalent to a 40% decline in turbine costs over the past decade. And over the same period, the cost of solar power capacity has fallen by 90%. We now need to repeat the same feat across the whole suite of engineering solutions that will take us to net zero. That includes solutions such as carbon capture and storage, because we're not yet at the event horizon, which says that we no longer need to use hydrocarbons. On current trends, they're still expected to account for more than 70% of the total world's energy mix in 2030. Until we reach the point that we can do without hydrocarbons, we need to decarbonize their use. CCUS provides us with the tools to do that, but deployment at a scale is the only way to create a commercially viable solution. So once something begins its journey down the learning curve, it rarely goes backwards, but it might require carefully designed incentives to kickstart that journey. And that's my second point this evening. Even in a well-functioning market, there will still be important risks that private investors might be willing to take, might not be willing to take. Someone needs to turn off their audio, please. To overcome this, they need to turn it off, please. Let me start again. To overcome this, the public sector may need to take on some of the upfront risk associated with the development of immature technologies or the displacement of incumbents in order to incentivize private investment. That's the natural role of government as the investor with the lowest cost of capital. It forms part of a modern industrial policy and should be embedded in national strategies for tackling climate change. But public investment in engineered climate solutions cannot usefully be done in national isolation. Climate change is a global problem, which requires global resource allocation to be at the heart of the solution. India, for example, is on track to almost double its greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, whereas the EU's emissions are already projected to fall by 50%, even if no further action is taken. The real-life impact of climate solutions developed in the United Kingdom or the EU will be very low, unless they can be exported and applied in countries where they might actually move the global needle. That's why a replacement for the failed United Nations Clean Development Mechanism would be a good outcome of COP26. This was originally designed to pull investment from developed nations into emissions reduction projects in developing nations, and was an important mechanism for encouraging a more efficient allocation of global resources. Another such mechanism would be a carefully designed and universally applied carbon tax, which I've been arguing for the past 25 years. But the practical challenges of implementation are significant. We don't yet have a standard way of measuring and reporting greenhouse gas emissions, and we're a long way from achieving the sort of global coordination needed to make a carbon tax really work across borders. We also need to consider that even perfectly designed incentive structures may not be enough to alter human behavior. Once we secure the rational economic foundations of net zero, we need to focus on the deeper motivations which lead people to act. And that's my third point for this evening. When I was CEO of BP, we identified a huge desire among our staff to take action on climate change. And this became the driving force behind the changes we made, which I first set out in the speech at Stanford University in 1997. The action we took had to make commercial sense, but it was just as important to understand people's hopes, fears, and dreams for the future. We won't reach net zero by asking people to change their behavior or make investments just because it's the economically sound thing to do. Most people don't really behave in a wholly rational way. And we won't create excitement about this huge transformation by telling people, in the words of one recent Guardian article, that greenhouse gas emissions need to fall by the, and I quote, equivalent of a global lockdown every 2 years for the next decade. I can't think of anything less exciting. Instead, it's essential that leaders tell positive stories about the path to net zero. And I can think of three. The first is about the transformative power of engineering. The pandemic has taught us that humanity can deliver extraordinary engineered solutions to global problems at speeds nobody thought possible. The second is about jobs. $3 trillion of investment every year represents a comprehensive retooling of the economy. As a businessman, I'm always skeptical when politicians talk about so-called green jobs. But when capital moves from low growth to high growth areas, it tends to generate more jobs, which is an unambiguously good thing. The third story is about public health. A recent survey found that more people are concerned about climate change than about catching COVID-19. I take this as a positive sign that, having experienced the public health disaster of the pandemic, people want to avoid what could be a public health catastrophe of climate change. By putting the protection of public health back at the heart of society, it really will be possible to build back better. And so that brings me to my fourth and final point. Society has learned a huge amount from the pandemic about managing crises. We must now apply those lessons to tackling climate change before it's too late. One lesson in particular stands out. At the very beginning of the pandemic, the US Nobel laureate economist Paul Romer argued in the New York Times for a national test and isolation system, which would cost around 100 billion US dollars. I remember many commentators simply dismissing this idea as far too expensive. But 12 months and a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill later, $100 billion seems like pretty good value for money. Faced with a spiraling crisis, a solution which seems prohibitively expensive might be seen very differently in the light of experience. It's essential to overreact at the beginning as early as possible in order to get under the problem before the problem gets bigger than any conceivable solution. And it is impossible to collect too much data. In the case of the pandemic, we didn't test enough people early enough, and so we were always playing catch up. In the case of climate change, if we don't get on top of emissions measurement and reporting, then we'll never know what we're really dealing with. We need a single source of truth, which means independently verified measurements and standardized reporting frameworks. Ladies and gentlemen, the world is awash with net zero targets, but plans for delivery are in pretty short supply. We now need to combine lofty ambition with clear thinking and public spirit with private enterprise. This year's COP26 conference is an opportunity to do just that and to turn from the theoretical to the practical. Public investment, taxes, regulation, and behavioral change all have a role to play. But Sir Denis Rooke was an engineer at heart, as I am. We were both presidents of the Royal Academy of Engineering. So it should come as no surprise when I tell you that the path to net zero is an engineering challenge of the highest order. It's a challenge that Sir Denis would have relished. Thank you very much.
Lord Browne, thank you very much for that thought-provoking speech. Thanks to the folks that have already put some questions in. I've got some questions that have already come in, and Peter, I see, has put one in the chat. This is the opportunity for everybody to have the undivided attention of Lord Browne for about the next 20 minutes. So please put some questions in the chat there. And he said that no topic can be untouched, so he's willing to go for any question. He will diplomatically dodge them if he needs to. So there is that warning there. So please put them into the chat. I'm joined now by Ben Clark, who is iGEM's president-elect, and between us we're now going to chair the question and answer session. So I'm going to hand over to Ben to do the first question, please, Ben.
Excellent, thanks, Tony. Okay, thank you very much, Lord Browne, for that excellent speech this evening. To get us up and running, you've touched on a couple of points, both at sort of more local level within the UK and in terms of the global level. From your perspective, what do you see as the key #1 challenge from both a UK perspective and a global perspective? Are they the same or are they different?
I think I come back to what I said in the speech. Of course, we always need to discover things, but they're not essential to get going on this path to net zero. So we really need to find ways of deploying existing solutions at scale, at speed. And I think the UK can do that. And it's beginning to show that it's capable of doing it. For example, things like the Teesside project or CCS and CC and carbon capture and use. As one example. Another example are the several companies that are coming out of the fringes of the Faraday project to do with electricity storage, and importantly, not just storage, but power demonstration. So a bit like a big capacitor, big power coming from electricity. So there are plenty of other examples. We need to tackle not just directly CO2 emissions, but also methane emissions. And we have tools and techniques here which will be very good as export projects for the future. And finally, if I'm allowed to pick four, I always think that the thing we have ignored is unprocessed plastic waste. 7 categories of plastic that all get increasingly difficult to deal with. We process at best just over 10% of the world's supply of waste. That's a lot of CO2 going up into the air when it's burnt, or it's land used which it could absorb CO2 when it's used for landfill. I think these things the UK can do something about. Just remember the perspective though. We are an important economy, but we've done pretty well on CO2 emissions. And so we don't have a lot to go for in the global context. So I'm very keen that the UK plays its role in catalyzing change elsewhere in the world. That's really important.
Excellent, thank you very much. Tony?
Yes, thank you. I'm going to go to the first question that came in on the chat from Peter. It says, BP has recently announced a new hydrogen CCS project on Teesside. How did you think the hydrogen economy would develop when you started BP's alternative energy division in the mid 2000s?
Well, one of the I knew it would develop. I had no idea about the speed. They say that if you make a prediction, you have to choose either the time scale or the amount, but never try and choose both at once if you don't have any history, and there was no history. But it was pretty clear that the cost of renewable energy was going to drop, and that's what I focused the company on. The techniques used today make what we were doing then look primitive and Stone Age-like. But that's about the learning curve, and it's about experience. But it was also about measurement of carbon dioxide and the ability to invest in areas that were easier to invest in and take credit across different assets, so-called carbon trading. Interestingly, one of the projects that we put up was at Peterhead, not at Teesside, but at Peterhead, which was to build was to reform natural gas, steam reform it. Use the hydrogen as both a fuel for electric power generation and as a chemical source, and to take the CO2 and dispatch it to the Miller field in the North Sea to increase the recovery of oil. It didn't work economically, and we were looking for some innovation incentives from the government, and they weren't forthcoming, and regrettably the project collapsed. It was almost there. I'm pleased to see it's being revived in different forms again and again. Hydrogen will be important. Obviously, blue hydrogen from steam reforming is very much on the cards. It's still expensive, but it can get cheaper. But it's not the wholly desirable end state, which has to be green hydrogen, and that's terribly expensive at the moment. So we need to think about how to engineer the cost of it down.
Thank you. Back to Ben.
Excellent, thank you. We're getting lots of questions in now, so I'll try and keep things moving. The next question we had in from our guest attendees this evening was a question regarding do you believe that the selling off of BP Solar was a touch premature?
Well, I think you have to ask the executives who did it at the time. I think my experience in my 25-year experience trying to replace oil and gas with other forms of energy is that it was a very tough thing to do. People looked at you and said, you're simply a tree hugger, you don't know what you're doing, and if you say anything against the oil and gas industry, you're going to destroy the industry. None of that, of course, was true, but it's a knee-jerk reaction to something which is new and which is a competitive threat. And it's moved everything along pretty well. So I don't know whether it was the right or wrong decision. What I do think, though, is that the manufacturing of solar panels, which is what BP Solar did a lot of, is best in the hands of a better cost place than Europe, and at scales which are unimaginably large compared with the sort of scales that we were using at the time. So on balance, in retrospect, it's probably a pretty good thing to have done.
Thank you. Tony.
So Sir Denis had the advantage of an integrated gas industry. In today's world, how do you envisage drawing multiple privatised players to work together?
Well, of course, that's something which has been around for a long time in many, many different resources. Oil, oil products, gas products, LPGs, condensates, things like that. So through the mechanism of supply and trading, it's possible to get it to the end customer, usually at a lower cost than single sourcing, usually. But it's the big problem is, of course, getting the infrastructure built. And Denis had an integrated challenge there. He just built it, much as people built the electricity grid with the CGB. So you have to therefore have some form of regulation to pull people together. Otherwise, you will have pipelines going hither and thither, and they won't be very efficient. And there'll be too many of them, too much planning consents. So I think that there has to be regulation here. A regulator has to look at fair play and making sure that people get good returns from building infrastructure. The returns aren't huge, but in my book anyway, but they're good infrastructure returns, and people get access to infrastructure if they don't own it at a fair and proper rate. We've been doing that for a long time, and I think we'll continue to do it when we have to generate new pipeline systems. There'll be lots of other questions about which end of the chain you can own, but we've been through that with electric power generation and transmission and distribution, and I think we'll apply probably the same principles to anything else we want to do.
Okay, next question, Ben.
Next question comes from Chris Clark. Fully support the idea of mass rollout of existing technologies, but how do we pick the right technology and enable new technology to come through? An example given was more and more solar does nothing for heating during the winter period.
Oh, absolutely right. So I think there has to be a natural development of the market. So first of all, there'll be a lot of different ways of doing one. I mean, the engineered solutions are all different, and people will make breakthroughs in the engineering of solutions such as CCS. I mean, it's not as if we're going to have one size fits all. We'll have lots of different experiments, and word travels quickly, of course, and then if it's better, people will apply a better thing. So to take I think the bigger point of the question is, what about the integrated energy system? So the energy system doesn't just, he's absolutely right, produce electric power. And there's only so much you can do with electric power, especially in industry. So we need heat. And we need motive power from very large machinery. So that's where natural gas has a role at the moment, and that has to be competitive with probably hydrogen in the long run, which its role will be there. Heating homes is, I think, a debate that will carry on for some time. Whether heat pumps actually make sense across the whole nation remains to be seen. Is it? Do we rethink natural gas? Do we think about electricity? Do we think about hydrogen and fuel cells creating electricity? Do we think about a lot of these things? I think the solution is not fully there, but we know how to do each one of those things.
Excellent, thank you very much. Tony.
So there's two questions here, and they're actually quite related. So I'm going to try and join them together. So first of all, there's a bit of an introduction. It says, you joined BP in the mid-1960s, about the same time as the gas industry was undertaking a significant landmark, that of converting the network from Towns gas to natural gas. Today, 50 years plus on, you've talked about the journey to net zero. So two parts to the question here from two different people. The first part is, do you think that in 50 years' time, we'll still be talking about the gas industry, talking about gas as an energy source? And if not 50 years, then when? And the other person had asked, could you comment on the future role of the gas pipe network as part of the solution, vis-a-vis hydrogen for heat and so on? So one about gas as a source, and then one about the infrastructure that exists today. If you could try and tackle both sides of that, please.
Well, so perhaps so if on a comparative basis, provided it is correctly handled, and I'll come back to that, natural gas beats oil and coal and biomass, which is grown for purpose, as emissions of carbon per unit of work created. So, but the big problem with natural gas is leak a bit of methane and you've just destroyed all that advantage. And there is a lot of work to be done, to secure gas's role as a proper ultra-low carbon fuel. And that is about monitoring, measuring, monitoring, and sealing up any form of methane leak. It's a big challenge. And what we do know from samples taken around the world is that reported methane leakage is heavily underestimated by a factor of between 2 and 10. So this is a very big deal, given that methane is probably what, 30 to 40 times more powerful, at least on the medium term basis, as a greenhouse gas than CO2. So it's a really important matter. Do I think hydrocarbons will be used in the energy system in 2070? I don't know. I think it's unlikely to be significant. There will be some, I'm sure, because it will be a natural fuel around the world where people will have no substitute for it. And after all, we don't have to eliminate everything. We can offset. If it's the last thing, you could offset any carbon that you haven't captured and stored with nature-based solutions. So unclear, 50 years, long time for forecast, I'd say. Gas pipeline networks, well, I think all infrastructure is used and reused whenever possible. So I appreciate fully as an engineer, I'm not a metallurgist, but I do know that we have to be really careful just to leap to the answer that we can transport hydrogen through every pipe that we've got. This is simply not true. But for a lot of it, we can either fix it, we can align it, we can use some of it for maybe hydrogen as a possible fuel for the future. This is not going to happen tomorrow. We need to reduce the cost of supply to something which people can actually afford and that doesn't ruin them when they turn on the heating in their house or industry go elsewhere.
Okay, thank you.
Excellent. Next question, Lord Browne, and it's a slight change of tact here. So, what do you feel that professional institutions such as IGEM can do more of to promote a positive greener economy? And with some of the changes that are going on within the industry, how do we combine these with encouraging a more diverse workforce? And I'm particularly, aware of that question in the context of the glass closet.
Well, it goes without saying that I'm a huge supporter of professional institutions, and they formed a lot of feed into the national academies, which are not institutions, they're academies of the most distinguished engineers in the land. So I think they're really important. They're important, obviously, for education, standard setting, and I think attitude. I've never approved of people trying to resist every change. I don't think IGEM does that at all. But some institutions have in the past resisted change, and therefore, rather than sitting at the same table as people who want to make a future, they've stood outside the table, and they slowly get ignored. And I think you can see that with some lobby groups. For example, the American Petroleum Institute, who was a master at being outside the real debate which was going on in the nation. I mean, everybody knows that there has to be an oil industry, but what sort of industry is the question, and how should it work? And that's that was something which could be handled by a cooperative approach to discussion. So I do think they're very important. Now, I think the record on diversity, on gender, BAME, LGBTQ plus is mixed right across, in particular, the engineering institutions, the engineering profession. It's getting better, definitely is getting better. I remember when I wrote the Glass Closet, I actually interviewed quite a few engineers and consulting engineers, and many of them said, look, this was a long time ago now, 10 years ago, they said, you know, we really couldn't come out because our employer says that our clients wouldn't like it. That's a pretty depressing thing. Now, that I think has changed a lot. I think the world has moved on. It doesn't say it's going to move forward the whole time. It may move backwards. So constant vigilance is needed here. And I much applaud codes of conduct which say the following: anyone who's bigoted, anyone who bullies is not fit to be a member of a great institution. And I think that's really important because there has to be a consequence for doing something which, you know, infringes people's human rights. And I feel very strongly about that, that whether it is color, race, physical appearance, sexuality, religion, you name it, gender, progress needs to be made. And it does take time. Someone asked me the other day, you know, how many women were employed by BP when I first joined? Well, first of all, there was no data. Secondly, my impression was that if you were a woman, you were either a secretary or you were in something which nobody remembers nowadays called the typing pool, where people sat in front of typewriters typing manuscripts, mostly written by white men. So it's come a long way, but not enough, as we can see from the data on boards, and in particular, not so much the boards of companies, but the top management, the management committee, the people who report to the CEO herself, very few of them, and getting fewer. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and that's the one we've been working on for the longest. So it's not surprising that everything else is lagging. So constant vigilance, constant work is needed.
Excellent. Thank you for that full answer, Lord Browne. It's excellent. Tony, over to you.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that and try and get some of your experience on the table here. And what from your career experiences would you say are the top tips that you would give to, I'll say young people wanting to enter the industry today, but you can apply it to your previous answer, looking at the whole diversity that we need to generate within the environments we operate today. What are your sort of top tips from your career that you would give to people that want to enter the industry, or how we should go about attracting them into the industry?
Well, I hate generalization, let me say immediately. And I will just finish my last answer. I'm often asked, is it the right thing for people to come out if they're gay? The answer is, this is not a group thing, it's an individual thing. And it depends on the circumstances and whether you feel safe. If you feel safe, that actually you've got a degree of understanding and people say, okay, we get it, then you can do it. If you don't feel safe, you shouldn't do it. So as to careers, I won't give generalized advice. What I found was this. I joined the oil industry first as a trial. I mean, I just sort of turned up and said, I really would like to go overseas. I'd like to work in the field and I'd like to go to America. And surprisingly, BP said yes to all of it. And I said, I'd like to work with you for a year to go back to Cambridge to do PhD. So they said, that's fine. And in those days, I got this letter, which is typical, Dear Browne, started, your posting to Anchorage, Alaska is confirmed. I hadn't realized that that's where I was going to be sent in the United States. I thought New York. Anyway, I loved it because I realized that I could solve problems that people weren't solving, had not yet solved. So the challenge of problem solving, and it allowed me to go deeply into engineering for the first part of my career. So I had a lot of roots. And the thing about anything when you start is there's an apprenticeship to it, you know. You have to do the same thing again and again under a master who tells you, actually, you've done it wrong. May I suggest you learn? You know, it's about doing again and again. So it becomes second nature. So I think at one end, I would say to people, first be yourself. Consider your circumstances. If you find your employer hostile to your being, you can't come out. Think about changing your employer to somebody who's more, dare I say, enlightened. So and think about being confident in yourself, because it's your choice. It really is your choice. And there are very many complexities to that choice, family, friends, and so forth. But one thing to remember, and I'll tell you my story, is I really thought that, so I was so used to being in the closet, because I thought that if I came out, I'd lose all my friends, my business contacts, people would take me seriously and so forth. And actually it turned out to be quite the reverse. But I had fixed in my head the way it was, and I never watched the world change around me. When I wrote The Glass Closet, I went off to Hay on Wye Literary Festival to present it. Guy got up in the audience at the Q&A. He was about 40 years old. He said to me, John, he said, I work for your competitor. So that's code for Shell. And he said, I want to say this. He said, we all knew you were gay. He said, the only problem was none of us were brave enough to come and tell you you were gay. Think about it. That says everything about being yourself. So at the other end of the telescope, as you go higher and higher up, it seems to me you need to think about two things, which might be quite good for life generally. One is always attach yourself to a great purpose. Don't let the day-to-day get in the way of the purpose. Purpose is really important. Leaders, like CEOs, should always attach to purpose. Purpose is important. And the second thing about leadership to remember is inclusion. You can't build a team, or people feel that they may be only part of your clique, but not somebody else's. You can't build a team, you can't engage people, and your performance will go down, and you're doing the wrong thing anyway. So if I were arming a leader with just 2 points, I'd say purpose and inclusion. The rest is all will come about in different ways. You know, how to run a spreadsheet, how to talk to investors, all of that will come about in different ways. But these two things are really important.
It's great advice, thank you.
I'm going to make this the last question, Lord Browne, because I'm conscious of time. So I'm afraid we'll need to be relatively brief. But the last question for this evening. Long-term political strategy is critical to support net zero, but we often struggle to have a long-term policy position because of the nature of our sort of parliamentary system. Have you got any thoughts about what we could do to try and rebalance that?
Well, obviously politics, the decisions, they come and they go, and they are very pragmatic because they have to both incorporate the majority, which is difficult, when political parties are very concerned about getting re-elected, and they have to be realistic as to the treasure that the country has. And that's why I think government must never try to crowd out the private sector. There's only so much government can do, but it's all about regulation, it's about taxes, it's for fiscal support, it's all these things. It's things that they can do. What they should not be is the investor. Because that, I think, that will come and that will go. I think it's you cannot rely on long-term promises from, I think, almost any government in the world.
Thank you very much, Lord Browne.
So, Lord Browne, thank you very much for answering those questions. I'm going to hand over to Ben now to just give a short summing up and conclude the evening for us. So thank you very much for your speech. Over to Ben.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Just let me say my own thanks again, Lord Browne, for your speech this evening. It's been absolutely excellent. So just to recap, Lord Browne shared a couple of critical points with us this evening, and just to tick these off one by one. Firstly, he talked about the investment, the scale of the investment that's required and the pace that is required for us to get to limit this temperature change to 1.5 degrees. And this has been estimated to be $3 trillion of investment every year for the next 10 years, which is equivalent of doubling our current rates of investment. And I think that's something we all need to be very conscious of. Secondly, it was a very clear point came through this evening about this is not really a challenge around new science or new discovery of science. It's about developing existing science and existing solutions at scale. And I particularly enjoyed some of the examples that were shared this evening in terms of the lighting. It's always good to know that we've got history on our side, and it's something that's been done many times before. I think one of the other critical points that was discussed this evening was the importance of global action. Within the UK, we are already quite far along our net zero journey. We don't necessarily have the capability or capacity to move the needle much in isolation, and it's critical that we reach more global consensus, and particularly around items such as a global carbon tax, and also to be backed up with common standards and cross-border measurements. I think also a key point, something I'm very conscious of in my own day-to-day, is the need to sell a positive vision to the public, and we have to be very aware of people's humans' behaviours. And Lord Browne shared a number of positive examples this evening about ranging from the vaccination through to jobs and public health. And I think given the year that we've all had in lockdown, I think we can all agree that it's critical to put the protection of public health back at the heart of society to truly build back better, to use that much politicised phrase. And finally, Lord Browne has this evening finished by emphasising how important it is to develop a single source of truth, something that we can all understand, that we can all apply ourselves to, and can be used to apply clear thinking to delivery going forward. I apologise that we've not had a chance to go through all of your questions this evening, but on behalf of everybody who's been with us, I would like to formally thank Lord Browne on behalf of IGEM for his excellent lecture. And I would like to now pass back to Neil, who's going to take us through a couple of short announcements. Thank you very much, Neil.
Yes, thank you, Ben. And my own personal thanks to Lord Browne for that excellent informative hour that we had with you. So as we close, I would just like to share two announcements with our audience that are relevant to supporting the theme of tonight in terms of forging the path to net zero. The first is an announcement regarding a new initiative for us. It's the Henry Cavendish series of webinars. And these will be a series of prestigious events running right through the year with leaders actively involved in the transition. And you see that schedule in front of you. They're going to be starting next month in April, beginning with Paul Bogers, Vice President Hydrogen of dare I say, Lord Browne's competitor, Shell. And then running right through to a very special session almost straight after COP26, in which we will be debating with key leaders, including government and the industry, with an event to analyse the outcomes of COP26, and that will be chaired by the Science Media Centre. So a really interesting one to put into your calendars, please. And my closing slide is to do with our brand new Hydrogen Knowledge Centre. Just launched last week. Some of you may have joined us for that particular event. And we are really delighted with this new initiative from IGEM. So developed with funding from the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. This new centre is an expanding repository of all hydrogen-related information that should build capability for delivery of net zero. And by that, it does so by providing kind of one-step access to emergent technical knowledge for that purpose. So finally, we're just going to run that introductory video for you, and then the session this evening will automatically close. So it's a pleasure now for me just to say good evening and thank you.
As the world continues to turn and energy industry leaders work toward our net zero carbon emissions targets, the dangers of climate change still loom, and there is ever increasing pressure for us to move away from fossil fuel dependency. We are seeing considerable growth in the exploration of low carbon hydrogen applications and technologies, with hydrogen research, trials and demonstrations underway internationally. The challenge for many is how they capture this breadth of hydrogen learning and stay up to date with the latest technical and policy developments. That's where iGEM comes in. This is the iGEM Hydrogen Knowledge Centre, a digital resource for everything related to hydrogen energy, with support from the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. iGEM have created a searchable repository of hydrogen records from a wide range of sources, including public agencies, gas network companies, academic and research institutions, supply chain organisations, and energy and engineering experts. As the professional institution for gas engineering, iGEM is passionate about supporting the transition to a net zero carbon emissions future. The Hydrogen Knowledge Centre is one of the ways in which we're playing our part. Our goal is to capture existing and newly published hydrogen learning, consolidating knowledge into one searchable library, making hydrogen information and research quick and easy to find. The Hydrogen Knowledge Centre will provide you with the latest hydrogen learning as it emerges. We take the legwork out of sifting through numerous websites, journals, and portals for information. The advanced dynamic search capabilities make filtering your search results simple. We also recommend other relevant resources based on your search and highlight the latest publications to you on the homepage. We would like to thank our key contributors for their support, and we will continue to build knowledge-sharing partnerships across academia, industry, and government. The effects of climate change are already a reality, but we have an opportunity to minimise its impact. As it stands, hydrogen technologies could provide a viable route to decarbonising areas such as heating, industrial processes, and heavy transport, and help make a meaningful reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now is the time to build on your understanding of hydrogen, discover new research, and share your own learning. iGEM is the place to start. To explore the Hydrogen Knowledge Centre and find out how to gain full access to iGEM's world-class repository of hydrogen resources, please visit h2knowledgecentre.com.